Beloved and despised, there's no female author quite as polarizing as Sylvia Plath. Rising to stardom for her uncanny ability to verbalize the internal fears we all wrestle to suppress, her legacy is plagued by bigotry, domestic distress, and prophetic prose. But it's not her novels or short stories, to be honest, that intrigued me the most. In fact, it's not even really her that caught my initial attention, but a Twitter account. This brilliant idea was spawned by one of my favorite trends online, and that is Twitter bot accounts. Now, I love a folklore lyric bot as much as the next person, but it is not Taylor that consumes my everyday waking night. Actually, it is in fact my Roman Empire, the Sylvia Plath food diary bot. Hear me out. Let's take a walk. Let me hold your hand, and you'll figure out how we got to this video.
Part fascination with vintage recipes and part morbid obsession with Plath, this Twitter is my own personal newspaper. I read it like there's interesting and intriguing news to be discovered, and to be honest, there often is. Because you see, it's here that the real meat of Plath's personality lies. In her journals and letters. I find you can learn much about a person by the food they like, even more so the ones they hate. But it's the why that influences those feelings that inspired this video. Who was Plath? Why was she so revered and controversial? And what did Ted Hughes have to do with anything? So I thought, what do I do with said fascination? How do I foster this connection in a healthy, educational way while spending hours researching the life of Sylvia Plath? And so this video was born. Think of it as Julie and Julia for rotting girls.
And just like Julia Child detested her modern day counterpart, I'm sure Sylvia Plath would adore me. But with that being said, sit back, relax, because today we are eating like Sylvia Plath.
On October 27th, 1932, Sylvia was born in Boston, Massachusetts, to parents Aurelia Scober and Otto Plath, making her a Scorpio, which tells you basically everything you need to know. She also, for reference, has a Libra moon and Aquarius rising, which I can imagine aid her immensely in terms of the whole moody, talented, mysterious, brooding author. Her mother was a second-generation Austrian-American, and her father was a German immigrant who taught biology and German at Boston University. Otto was also an accomplished entomologist who went on to publish a book on bumblebees, and is said to be one of the very first influences on Plath's writing, most infamously the inspiration behind her polarizing poem, Daddy. Daddy chronicles the life of a fictional character and her relationship with her Nazi-sympathizing father, which is quite contrasting to reality, as in 1914, Otto Plath would come under investigation by Imperial Germany after failing to purchase bonds when the United States declared war against the regime. He was ultimately let go and found innocent of any crimes, but remained critical of his home country until his death, which unfortunately for Plath would come quite swiftly. After the birth of her brother Warren, Otto's health began to take a dive. Sylvia's father was convinced he had cancer, refusing any and all medical treatment, until he is officially diagnosed with a severe case of type 2 diabetes, eventually leading to the amputation of his foot due to gangrene. Unfortunately, he would not survive long after the surgery, ultimately succumbing to his illness on November 4th, 1940, just a week and a half after Sylvia's 8th birthday. She is not allowed to attend his funeral. And it's after his death that Sylvia is published for the first time, with 8-year-old poet, or poem, depending on what source you look at, debuting in the Boston Herald's children's section. Along with the submission was a simple letter stating, "Dear Editor, I have written a short poem about what I see and hear on hot summer nights."
So what made Sylvia's poem stand out amongst the ABC 1, 2, 3 ramblings of the other 8-year-olds? Honestly, probably not much. But what I think sets her apart early on is this unmistakable emotional depth and this kind of precocious ability to tap into feelings that seem well beyond her years, most likely due to the death of her father. Even as a child, you can already start to see that dark, introspective edge that would come to define her later works.
From the inception of her career, Plath has been praised for her ability to bring beauty to the mundane. Fans of her work are mystified by the way she is able to hoist up the rugs of reality and unearth these tiny moments we all seem to share, making her a founding member of what would go on to be coined confessional poetry, made famous for its tendency to break literary and societal norms. But how does one so integral to a movement become part of it? How did Sylvia gain popularity? Before we answer that, though, I think breakfast is ready.
For our first meal of the day, I decided to search her birthday in the Bots lexicon. What I found was several lovely entries, which admittedly did make me smile. It seems throughout her life, her ability to celebrate her birthday wasn't tarnished by its proximity to her father's passing, although it would go on to haunt the narrative for the rest of her life. And so for breakfast, I settled on a simple German coffee cake as an homage to Otto.
After the passing of her father, Sylvia would move to Wellesley, Massachusetts, where her mother would teach secretarial studies at Boston University. This move would mark a pivotal moment in the young author's life. In one of her final works, Plath remarks on the shedding of the first 9 years of her life and how they crystallized within the catacomb of her subconscious. They had sealed themselves off like a ship in a bottle, beautiful, inaccessible, obsolete, a fine, white flying myth. And it's 2 years after this statement, at the tender age of 11, that she starts her infamous journals. Much of her inner thoughts exist outside of Twitter threads and interviews. In fact, Sylvia's unabridged diaries end up published after much disdain towards the heavily abridged and allegedly biased version previously published in the 80s by Ted Hughes. Not much is known about Sylvia's life pre-high school, but her name does reappear in 1947. This time, though, it's not for writing. In fact, Plath wins a Scholastic Award for painting. You see, on top of being a best-selling author and ingenue, Plath is also a gifted artist. However, paint isn't her only medium. She's also fond of collage art, you know, the ones I'm talking about, made with X-Acto blades and newspaper clippings. Using these pieces, Sylvia builds the world around her with letters and shapes, and much like her writing, the subject material stays the same. Plagued by self-doubt, disordered eating, fear of war, and just about anything a 1950s housewife might balk at. Plath would go on to attend Wellesley High School, and in 1950, just after graduation, she is published nationally for the first time in the Christian Science Monitor, which, despite its name, isn't actually a religious publication at all. It's what comes after high school that sets Sylvia on the path to becoming the contemporary darling we recognize today. Fresh from national publication, she receives a scholarship to Smith, a private all-girls liberal arts college, and it's here she begins to find her own voice. Sylvia edits the small school paper, the Smith Review, and spends her days reading and writing away the time. And eventually, it pays off. In 1952, Sylvia lands a coveted spot as editor of Mademoiselle magazine and a whopping $500 American after submitting a short story titled Sunday at the Mintons. But what exactly is Mademoiselle magazine, and why is it so important? Well, it'll sound quite familiar if you've read her most celebrated work, The Bell Jar.
Mademoiselle magazine was published by Smith & Street, which is like a nickel and dime magazine house. It was a magazine geared towards what they described as the modern woman. They would take care to differentiate between young girls and the college educated, and they kind of set their sights on the budding artists of today's generation. And in an attempt to do this, they launched their editor program, where young female writers from across the country had the ability to spend the summer living in New York City, working as the editor-in-chief for the August issue, with an accompanying stay at the iconic Barbizon, New York's first female-only hotel.
But not all that glitters is gold, and shortly after arriving to New York, Sylvia is sure she's made the wrong choice. The initial indication of a problem comes from a relatively surface-level disappointment. You see, Sylvia's editor Sybil is set to meet the Welsh poet Dylan Thomas, someone who, by an ex-boyfriend's account, Sylvia adored more than life itself. And when Plath finds out she hasn't been invited, she's distraught. So much so that she spends 2 entire days pacing outside the Chelsea Hotel and stalking the infamous White Horse Tavern. Yes, I'm talking about that tavern, home to Jack Kerouac and the rest of the Beat Crew. But it would be to no avail. Thomas was already on his way home, and though he would return to NYC in 1953, Sylvia would be unsuccessful in ever crossing his path, as shortly after arriving to the city, Dylan Thomas would suffer a stroke that sent him into a coma, ultimately passing away at age 39. But it's not just this missed opportunity that she's struggling with. Years of repressed grief and trauma begin to bubble up as her stay at the Barbizon Hotel comes to a close. She applies to a writing seminar held at Harvard by the esteemed Irish author and ex-IRA member John O'Connor, but is ultimately denied entry. In her journal, she documents this perceived failing and hallmarks it as the first time she self-harmed, stating she tried to slash her legs to see if she had enough courage to take her own life. She chronicles her depression in depth in her journals, speaking about it as a dark abyss, one constantly whispering to her, goading her, and guiding every action she takes, which is what leads her to try a new and interesting means of treatment, one we now know has horrific and irreparable consequences. I'm talking about ECT. Doctors in the 1940s and 50s were obsessed with curing women of hysteria, which is a wide term they use for anything from depression to reactive abuse. Women at the time needed to be happy, to be docile. They didn't work, therefore didn't have to worry about the bills or climbing the corporate ladder. So surely they must have nothing to trouble them or repress their joy. But it's this exact way of thinking that leads Sylvia to seek out relief from self-harm and depression. Because she's walking a very fine line. Outside of real-world complications that arise when your mental health is at its melting point, there's tons of social shame to bear. It's all fine and well for male authors to be broody and depressed or struggling with addiction. It adds a certain je ne sais quoi to their celebrity. But the options for female authors are slim. So Sylvia does her best to keep a lid on the internal pressure cooker. Unfortunately for her, it's all about to blow.
Oh! I think lunch is ready. BRB.
Lunch was a bit of an odd affair. I mean, the phrase ladies who lunch got its name from the leisure class of the 50s and 60s. Women whose days were only said to be preoccupied by gossip and neck salad. But Sylvia was an East Coast girl, so she ate a decent amount of extravagant lunches. And since it's soup season, how could we not pay homage to her East Coast roots by eating some lobster bisque?
I personally love this soup. I think that the brown butter poached lobster that you top it off with makes all the difference, but you let me know in the comments below if you make it. Remember what I said about it all being ready to blow? Well, unfortunately for Sylvia, it does.
On October 24th, 1953, Sylvia would make her first documented attempt at ending her life. The now 20-year-old Plath, returning home from Wellesley, would take a handful of her mother's sleeping pills and climb under their basement porch. Of this first attempt, Plath simply states, "I blissfully succumbed to the whirling blackness that I honestly believed was eternal oblivion." But as we now know, her first attempt is unsuccessful, and Sylvia has just earned herself a 6-month stay at McLean Hospital, made famous by author Susanna Kaysen's best-selling memoir, Girl Interrupted. But this story might already sound familiar, especially if you've read Esther Greenwood's account of her stay at Belsize, the swanky private asylum for the elite she's sent to after leaving the horrid city hospital. The city hospital in question being Mass General, where under the care of the head doctor, Sylvia is subjected to more ECT and a new form of therapy, insulin treatment, which again is about as horrific as it sounds. Patients are sedated and given copious amounts of insulin to send their body into a semi-catatonic state, often resulting in the patient being in a coma for several days of the week. If you're a type 1 diabetic, this might sound familiar. But Esther and Sylvia recover, and they leave McLean together. So how? What changed here in Plath's story that stayed the same in Kaysen's? The answer is easy, as while she's at McLean, Sylvia is treated for the first time by a female doctor for her clinical depression. Enter in Ruth Barneshouse, the basis for the bell jar's marvelous Dr. Nolan. When Ruth meets Sylvia, she's fresh from school and new at McLean. In an interview on her first initial meeting with Sylvia, Ruth remarks on her inexperience. "Sylvia was about the second or third patient I ever had. Dr. Lenderman, chief of psychiatry at Mass General, of which McLean was an affiliate, decided she needed to talk to a woman. McLean was a small, cozy hospital in those days. A very good hospital. But then I wondered, what makes Sylvia's case special? Why does the chief of the hospital spend so much time delegating to the care of this one woman? She hasn't published a novel yet or even graduated school. There's no literary stardom to grant her favor. Well, remember when I talked about her first attempt? The one where she crawled into the cellar under her porch and waited for the abyss to swallow her whole? Well, she isn't exactly discovered overnight. In fact, it takes 2 days for her brother to discover her barely conscious body beneath the porch. And by that time, Sylvia had made quite the news scandal. A beautiful, talented blonde white woman is missing after seemingly showing no signs of addiction or issues. Well, that's a front page story. In fact, Plath has over 250 news articles written about her disappearance. And it's this minor celebrity that gets her transferred from State Hospital to cozy little McLean. Because you see, Sylvia does not come from money. There's no way she could even afford to stay a week at McLean. Yet, she spends 6 months in the hospital under the care of Ruth/Nolan. all thanks to a philanthropist named Olive Higgins Prouty, or as the bell jar reader might know her, Philomena Guiney. Olive Higgins Prouty is the American author best known for her 1923 novel Stella Dallas, which documents a mother's journey to do anything to protect her daughters and their social standing in society. It's written in memoriam to her two daughters, Anne and Olivia, years after their passing. And if the name sounds familiar, you might have seen one of the 3 film adaptations, including Stella, starring the iconic Bette Midler. But it's after the death of her second daughter that Olive dedicates her life to child rearing and philanthropy. And it's in 1950 that Sylvia becomes the recipient of the Olive H. Prouty Scholarship. So that's how the two are connected. But I was perplexed. Sylvia won a scholarship and then 3 years later the benefactor pays for her stay? Seems a bit odd on the surface, but it's Olive who understands Sylvia more than Philomena's portrayal would have you believe. You see, at the age of 12, Olive suffers from her first nervous break. Lasting for 2 years, she's hard-pressed to return to school, and even harder so to maintain her composure. But she does, and she goes on to graduate from Smith College in 1904 with a bachelor's degree in literature. But her perceived freedom is simply an illusion. After graduating, Olive moves back to Rochester, at the behest and beratement of her family. More so, her mother, a staunchly religious woman who valued children and a family above all else, so much so that she is literally the creator and founder of the PTA. All of your moms can thank her when they have to make 4 trays of cookies for the annual spring fundraiser. But Olive is lucky. Her new husband is enamored with her talent and even urges her to continue schooling at Radcliffe, the female liberal arts college at Cambridge. And though she doesn't go back to study, she doesn't stop writing. But it's what she does with her talent that I believe leads to such a negative portrayal of her character in The Bell Jar. I believe it's a common modern misconception that Sylvia hated men, that feminist ideals and critical lenses can mask one's true feelings. Ruth Barnhouse knows this all too well. On Sylvia, she says, "She did not feel that men were the oppressors. Her fight was always between her and other women." She goes on to say, "To be sure, Sylvia's problem was with women. That's part of the archaic qualities, because for her, men were pawns on the female chessboard. But superimposed on what I just said was her neurosis, which had very much to do with her father dying at the age he died. The death of her father was crucial."
Could that be why Sylvia portrays Olive so cruelly in The Bell Jar, seeing her as another failed role model who succumbed to suburbia and motherhood, stuffing away her potential for the patriarchy? Maybe. If you ask my opinion, I think it's a mix of pretentious bravado, mental illness, and indescribable jealousy.
Here is a woman whose father paid for her schooling, allowed it and encouraged it, only for her mother to cruelly crush all dreams she had for freedom. But in the end, she still wins. Her new husband is an academic and a gentleman who wants nothing more for the educated woman he fell in love with to continue down that path. Olive is rich, loved, and despite Sylvia's protesting, talented. Everything Plath feels she is not. For in the novel, Esther describes Philomena's work as trashy and romantic, media she would never dare to consume. Her stay is paid for, her doctor is a woman, and things are finally looking up for Sylvia. In December, Ruth Barnhouse convinces her to do another round of ECT, explaining how the doctor at Mass General completely botched the treatment and assuring her that this time the results will vary. And she is unfortunately correct. After 2 simple treatments, Sylvia has drastically improved. So much so, she's no longer deemed unfit to care for herself and is set to be released in the new year. Or that's what the official records would have you believe. However, Ruth Barnhouse tells a different story. Weeks prior to noticing how upset Plath became after visits from her mother and Olive Prouty, Barnhouse bars all visitation until further notice, a decision that upset and allegedly infuriated Olive and Aurelia Plath. So much so, they were planning on taking Sylvia from McLean. However, at the behest of her doctors, she is allowed to stay. The one condition, Prouty will no longer pay for Plath's treatment after January of the new year, a hissy fit that no doubt speaks to the controlling nature of their relationship. And so, Sylvia is released and back at Smith to finish out her time at school. And 2 years later, in 1955, after handing over her thesis, The Magic Mirror, a study of the double in 2 of Dostoevsky's novels, she goes on to graduate summa cum laude as a member of the oldest academic honor society in the country, Phi Beta Kappa.
But for now, I think I need a snack. Sylvia is quite fond of a snack. She talks about them at length in her journals and various other published pieces. And lucky for her, she's about to have a plethora of new options, as Sylvia is crossing the pond, this time on another more prestigious scholarship, to study at Newham, one of 2 female-only colleges at Cambridge.
Sylvia lands herself the coveted Fulbright Scholarship, which till this day is an extremely sought-after and highly regarded award. Created in 1946 by Arkansas State Senator J. William Fulbright, the fund was a way to bolster international relations post-Second World War. Fulbright aimed to bring a little more knowledge, a little more reason, and a little more compassion into world affairs, and thereby increase the chance that nations will learn at last to live in peace and friendship. And I can't say that he was wrong. Sending each country's brightest and best off to study in another environment or language seems almost essential to our survival. And with Sylvia's reported IQ being in the 160s, she should be a shoo-in for a Fulbright. But as Ruth Barnhouse accounts, it wasn't that simple. Of this, she says, getting a Fulbright in the middle of the McCarthy era for someone who had been in a mental hospital wasn't easy. The McCarthy era referring to the Second Red Scare, an American political movement which sought to identify and eradicate alleged Soviet spies, all led up by conservative politician Joseph McCarthy, who declared he had in his possession a list of 205 names of said alleged spies. But what does an American political movement have to do with Sylvia receiving the scholarship? Well, like most political movements, it didn't stop in the State House. McCarthyism took on a life of its own, morphing anti-war liberal mentalities into some sort of anti-American socialism. McCarthyism aimed to demonize academics and Hollywood elites alike, villainizing anyone who would dare critique the Department of Justice and their treatment of suspected Soviets. And remember that national publication, the one who first published Plath's work? Well, the Christian Science Monitor is the publication that actually coins the term McCarthyism in a scathing article accompanied by this now famous political cartoon. So Plath has made national headlines, been hospitalized, and has ties to the mag that is currently critiquing the United States government. Not exactly the poster child representation Fulbright wants to send overseas. But Sylvia is no Ethel Rosenberg. So Barnhouse, writing to the review committee, assures them that Sylvia is fit for the situation. And upon review, her scholarship is awarded. But fresh from McLean, her mental health is fragile. On if she actually thought Plath was fit for Europe, Ruth has this to say. How could she not pursue a Fulbright? And how could I stand in the way of her doing that? She felt that far too many people tried to control Sylvia. Everyone had an idea of who and what she should be. I was bending over backwards not to take a piece of her. And I believe this is why Philomena and Dr. Nolan's portrayals are vastly different. Or maybe it has to do with the relationship developed between the two, something journalist Karen Marotta highlights in her 2004 interview with Ruth. Marotta on the two. I was left with the inescapable conclusion that this talented therapist had certain blind spots for Sylvia that may have interfered with her treatment. While it's clear these two women forged a powerful relationship that helped Sylvia Plath, they also crossed some professional boundaries along the way. And she's not the first to make this conclusion, as the 30-year-old Ruth and 18-year-old Plath kept up a relationship until her untimely death, one documented by heartbreaking and often sensual letters, ones who are held by Smith College and won't be available for public viewing for the foreseeable future. So why is this important? Why do we care about the letters and kept secrets? Well, much like her Twitter, it's in her relationship with Ruth Barnhouse post-McLean I feel offers insights into deeper recesses of Plath's persona.
But for the sake of an accurate timeline, we need to talk about the other side of the coin, the male yin to Ruth's yang. Ted Hughes. Let's talk about it.
If you're familiar with her work, then you have already deduced why, but for those who don't know, Ted Hughes was Sylvia Plath's first and only husband. Remember at the beginning of the video where I said her legacy is plagued by bigotry and mystery? Well, it's largely to do with Ted Hughes and his view on the world. Because you see, most of Sylvia's success comes posthumously. Almost everything we know about the two of them comes from her journals and stories, most of which, especially in Sylvia's case, have been edited and redacted to save face. But it's important to remember a person's roots when later down the line we'll dig up their dirt. I want to warn you now that Ted and Sylvia have a complicated relationship, one hinted at in fiction but canonized in her letters. Born Edward James Hughes to William and Edith Hughes, Ted grew up a far cry from the East Coast upbringing that shaped Sylvia. Spending time between farms in Calder Valley, West Yorkshire, and the moorlands, Ted's childhood was a humble one that was bookended by his father's service in the First World War. William served the nation of England and participated in the infamous Dardanelles campaign, a military option that sought to seize control of the Dardanelles Straits. As the story goes, the naval campaign was a catastrophic failure, and instead of turning tail and submitting to the Ottoman Empire, the English, with their French and Australian allies, launched a risky ground invasion, one that would prove to be one of the deadliest in modern history. It would go on to be referred to as the Gallipoli Campaign, and Ted Hughes' father William would be one of just 17 men to return from his company. Upon his father's return home, Ted is inundated with stories of no man's land, a term for the mile-long trenches that would separate enemy forces during ground battle. An archaic and horrific way to fight, Ted would document how his father's experience shaped his view on the world, most specifically in his famous poem Out. But unlike Sylvia, Ted isn't an academic scholar at a young age. Ted's love for poetry grows about as slowly as the trees and crows around him. So much of his early work exists as an homage to the foliage and fowl, but also the death, the life cycle, and an almost morbid fascination of the changing of things. In fact, it is until secondary school, at the urging of his teacher, that Ted begins to write more seriously. It's here he's introduced to beloved author T.S. Eliot, and it's then he starts his mentorship, under the watchful eye of his sister Olwen, who Sylvia would come to detest, though one may say the feeling was quite mutual. More on that later. By age 16, Ted refused any other dream except that of becoming a poet and set out to make it happen. After publishing his first poem in 1948, he wins an exhibition at Pembroke College, the third oldest school in Cambridge. Hughes is honored and bewildered, but his father's voice echoes softly in the back of his head, leading Ted to defer, choosing to do his compulsory national service first. Think of it as an English version of the draft.
But once he's back at Cambridge, Ted finds himself stifled by the structure of academia, more so the pressures to write on demand. So he switches to anthropology, and though he would still struggle academically, his studies find new ways to influence his writing. So much so that he and a few friends decide to create their own student publication at Cambridge, known as the St. Botolph's Review. And in February of 1956, it's at its launch party for the first and only print run, Sylvia would meet Ted for the first time. 1 year into her studies at Newham, Plath is introduced to Ted after being a self-admitted fan of his work. Although the two wouldn't start dating immediately this day they met, they spent some time apart for travel. By Sylvia's own account, the two were inseparable from this moment on. So much so that a mere 4 months later, Sylvia and Ted are wed at St. George the Martyr, Holborn, in a traditional Catholic service, one where her mother is the only attendee. And Aurelia, fresh from America, doesn't stay in England. In fact, she actually accompanies the couple on their honeymoon to Spain, which Sylvia documents in her journals as the ever-stifling presence she's endured since childhood. But for now, the young couple is happy. Upon returning to Cambridge to finish their studies, both Sylvia and Ted find success in publishing. Both having pieces picked up by national journals, they move into a flat together in Chalcot Square, London, where Plath would go on to type the manuscript for Ted's iconic and award-winning book Hawk in the Rain, whose literary success would land him a book deal with Harper, immediately skyrocketing Ted Hughes to literary stardom and giving him enough prestige to make his dream of writing become a reality. But what's Sylvia doing at this time, this fast-tracking of Hughes' stardom? Well, the same September that sees Ted's publication marks the start of Sylvia moving back to America, this time with Hughes in tow. However, this time around, she's on the other side of the podium, teaching at her alma mater, Smith College. Although at this time, Sylvia is documenting her internal struggle, feeling unfulfilled and unable to write until the couple moved to Boston, where Sylvia actually takes up a secretary job at a familiar haunt, the hospital she visited post first attempt, Mass General. She's working as a secretary for the psychiatric wing of the hospital. And her return to Boston means one other thing: her return to Ruth Barnhouse. Except my research would show Ruth's been here the entire time. In fact, the two have been exchanging weekly letters since Sylvia departed from London. Sadly, only 14 letters remain till this day.
In her 2004 interview with Karen Marotta, Ruth compares the amount of letters she had from Sylvia to spanning about a foot long when all lined up. Some hundreds of letters chronicling her time at Newham, her marriage to Ted, and most importantly, the mysterious and highly theorized last year of her life. When asked what happened to the letters, Ruth's answer is a curious one, because she admits that she burned them. And when asked why, her response is a simple, "I don't know." Barnhouse goes on to explain, "It was after my divorce and I burned a lot of things. I was starting over," stating later in the interview the deep regret of burning said letters. So Sylvia is in treatment with Ruth, back on American soil and feeling better. But it only depends on who you ask, as this time around, Ted doesn't exactly know that Sylvia is receiving treatment, much less with Ruth. This time, Sylvia has to sneak off to sessions, only being able to pay a portion of the hourly fee as to not raise suspicions towards where the missing money is. You see, Sylvia's family doesn't approve of Ruth or her relationship with Sylvia. But Barnhouse is complicated, and her feelings for Sylvia extend past those of a professional, so she allows her treatment to continue, despite the peculiar nature of their relationship. And I want to use the word relationship lightly. Sylvia's complex feelings towards Barnhouse are documented in her journals and some of her remaining letters, and in them, her earlier stated problem with women arises. In a journal entry dated December 17th, 1958, Sylvia writes, "Angry at RB for changing appointment tomorrow. Shall I tell her? Makes me feel like she does it because I am not paying. She does it and is symbolically withholding herself, breaking a promise. Like mother not loving me, breaking her promise of being a loving mother each time I speak to her or talk to her, that she shifts me about because she knows I'll agree nicely and take it, and that it implies I can be conveniently manipulated. A sense of my insecurity with her accentuated by floating, changeable hours and places. The question is she trying to do this, or aware of how I might feel about it, or simply practically arranging appointments?" You see, Sylvia didn't simply enjoy Ruth's company or therapeutic method. It was something more akin to parental admiration and platonic eroticism.
During her year back in Boston, her day-to-day mood seems to be dictated by Ruth Barnhouse's response to her existence, a dynamic that Barnhouse admits was there from the beginning. Remember that miracle ECT treatment? The one that cures Sylvia and clears her to leave McLean? Well, Sylvia's journals tell us another story, as does Barnhouse. In an interview for Rough Magic, a biography of Sylvia Plath by Paul Alexander, Ruth speaks candidly about the reality of Sylvia's recovery, as she felt in some way Sylvia's agreement to give ECT another try might be born from a desire to self-harm, and she's completely on the money. In a January 3rd, 1959 journal entry, Sylvia gets candid about her motivations for treatment. Why, after the amazingly short 3 or so shot treatments, did I rocket uphill? Why did I feel the need to be punished, to punish myself? Why do I feel now I should be guilty, unhappy, and feel guilty if I'm not? Why do I feel immediately happy after talking to RB? Able to enjoy every little thing. And this isn't the only time. In fact, Sylvia writes ad nauseum about Ruth in her journals, using her as this pseudo stand-in for her overbearing mother. Sylvia once again on Barnhouse. "I believe in RB because she is a clever woman and knows her business, and I admire her. She is for me a permissive mother figure. I can tell her anything and she won't turn a hair or scold or withhold her listening, which is a pleasant substitute for love."
Hold on. Love? Yes, you heard me correctly. So much so, Karen Marotta questions Ruth about the acknowledgement of said feelings. "Did you encourage Sylvia to talk about her feelings toward you?" asked Marotta. Surprisingly, she said she did not. Whether romantic feelings existed between the two, we will never know. Shortly after her interview with Marotta, Barnhouse would pass away from complications due to age. However, in her parting words, the interview takes an interesting turn. When asked about the one thing Ruth Barnhouse would like people to know about Sylvia, she states implicitly that Sylvia was not a lesbian. Unprompted and curiously, Barnhouse points to a book on a nearby shelf, one containing the scandalous poem aptly titled Lesbos, which chronicles a visit between Sylvia and a female friend. Instead of acknowledging these complex feelings and emotions, Barnhouse admits to shifting focus onto Sylvia's feelings about her mother, Ted, and other important people in her life. And then I thought, what of Ted? What did Barnhouse, more importantly Sylvia, think of their marriage at this point in the timeline? Well, Ruth isn't impressed. Reportedly meeting Hughes for high tea in the couple's Boston apartment for the first time, a highly unusual and extremely unprofessional decision, going so far to admit at first she found him charming or agreeable, however noting how swiftly his veil was lifted, with Barnhouse being certain that Sylvia had made the wrong choice, even at one point flat out calling Ted evil, something one can hardly blame her for, as later letters between the two would reveal Sylvia's admission of alleged domestic violence she suffered at the hands of Hughes. All of this being said, Plath's feelings aren't one-sided. In fact, after some slight reluctance, Barnhouse admits to Marotta she loved Sylvia as well, something once again documented through their letters. For instance, Ruth Barnhouse in a closing statement to Plath, "I have often thought, if I cure no one else in my whole career, you are enough. I love you. Good luck. RB."
But remember, this is the 50s after all, a decade plagued by Jim Crow and homophobic honor killings. Therefore, leading heterosexual expression to take on a much different and wider range. Plath's musing and Barnhouse sign-offs may simply be a hallmark of a time gone by, or they may have been more. But unfortunately for Barnhouse, at this point in the timeline, Sylvia's time stateside would come to a swift end, with the couple planning to return to England, this time to welcome the birth of their first child, a daughter named Frida. After giving birth to her daughter in April, Sylvia sets her sights on publishing her first novel, Colossus, a collection of poems. Colossus is inspired by a plethora of things: Sylvia's adolescence, the loss of her father, her time at McLean, but most ardently and overarching is her inner dialogue. What I find so interesting though is Colossus is actually inspired by something more peculiar, something most people would reference as the occult. In fact, spoiler alert, that's how it gets its name. And I'm talking about a good old-fashioned Ouija board.
Because it's here that Plath finds inspiration for not only the material that composes the collection, but also the name. Said to be named after a spirit entity named Colossus that communicated with Plath via the minor god Pan. Pan being the half-human, half-centaur god of shepherds, hunters, and the untamed wild. But it's not just classics and philosophy for the couple. Their belief in the occult is very much alive and thriving, at one point being the main pillar in which their relationship rested upon. Hughes, being semi-interested in the occult, introduces Sylvia to the idea of scrying as meditation in preparation for her return to writing. With an overturned scotch glass, the two spend night after night asking questions to the board. Some silly, questions of what should be for dinner or what horses to bet on. Others more insightful, like the night Sylvia asks the spirit if her book will be published and if so with who, and answer the spirit guesses correctly. Though Sylvia is reluctant at first, she quickly changes her tune, much to the delight of Hughes. At one point, Sylvia begins to even read tarot cards, developing a relationship with Pan and the leader of the spirits who resides within him, someone she refers to in her journal as Colossus, someone who she believes is allowing her father to send her messages from the beyond, someone she named her first publication after. The original publication contains 40 poems, the names of which you'll see on screen, and was about 80 pages in length when its manuscript was submitted. Colossus is a culmination of Sylvia's life pre-motherhood and fame, and as you'll come to find out, it's one of 2 pieces published while Plath is still alive. It includes but 1 poem of her year in England pre-publishing, simply titled You Are, a documentation of her pregnancy with Frida. In the Pulitzer Prize-winning biography Red Comet, The Short Life and Blazing Art of Sylvia Plath by Heather Clark, more detail is given about the state of Plath's psyche during the duration of her 20s. You see, Sylvia has gone out of her way to ensure that her relationship with Ted isn't the reason she's successful. So much so, she refuses to send any work of hers to Faber and Faber, the publisher of Ted's previous stories. And it's a big deal. Faber is no little-name publishing house. In fact, at the time, it's the most prestigious publishing house in England, one that was at one time edited and directed by the T.S. Eliot. After months of rejection, Sylvia documents the worry she feels of embarrassing Ted by submitting any work she deems as subpar. Even her old haunt Mademoiselle isn't biting, having moved on to its new muse California cool girl / author Joan Didion, who sees her piece Berkeley's Giant, the University of California, published by the mag in January of the same year. The only issue is her royalties are a measly 10%, something the currently financially struggling Sylvia knows she can't live on. But the prestige alone is enough to secure another book, with hopefully bigger advances. So she takes the bait and, in her own words, is better for it.
Our beloved Plathbot does document this moment, one that is bookended by veal chops and champagne, but I personally am not one for veal or really for drink, so I opted out. However, it's at this time in her story that the bot becomes more than just a grocery list and a recipe. This time in her journals also marks the purchase of a big American fridge, and with it, a top-of-the-line, brand new gas oven. One that she's remiss to buy despite her enjoyment in the kitchen, expressing her worries to her mother about her spending, and at one point even asking if the gas stove cost her too much, a statement that would go on to have a life of its own. However, at this time, she and Ted are in rare form. The couple spend lazy days in bed writing, eating, and swapping the household duties. But eventually, motherhood and postpartum start to weigh on Sylvia. So much so that after some concerning conversations, Olive Prouty sends her a whopping $300 American to see another private doctor, which in today's money is about roughly 3,000 American dollars, which is nothing to shake your fist at and gives you an insight into Plath's psyche at this point.
Although meanwhile, Ted's career is taking off. Hughes becomes a regular commentator on the BBC, sharing his new works via radio broadcasts and critic panels. His new lack of free time, mixed with the suburban standards of the 60s, means Sylvia is left to do most of the child rearing, and she's bogged down by it, exclaiming in letters to her mother and doctor that the precipice she's walking on is becoming much more narrow. But unfortunately for her, her troubles are far from over. After discovering she is pregnant for the second time, Sylvia is cautiously optimistic. She spends her days writing and trying to not worry about the added stress of a second child. But unfortunately for her, those fears never come to fruition. Sylvia experiences a miscarriage, one that plagues her and falls under suspicious circumstances depending on who you ask. Because you see, remember Ruth Barnhouse, the psychiatrist Sylvia saw in secret? Well, she's still here, communicating with Sylvia the entire time. And it's in one of her letters to Barnhouse, Plath reveals a shocking truth. Just days before her miscarriage, Plath alleges Hughes had beat her, and actually alludes to having caused the loss. And that's not all. She goes on to reveal the reason behind the alleged abuse, the reason being a person. One Moira Doolin, an influential female producer at the BBC, of which Ted and Sylvia were now regular broadcasters. However, Ted had started to develop somewhat of a literary cult following, one that bothered Sylvia, as she was aware not all who lusted after her husband were simple schoolgirls, but instead were accomplished academics, not much different from Plath herself.
And this fear would be validated one day when a pregnant Plath answered their home phone in Devon to find Doolin on the other side. And Moira Doolin, much to her shock, was surprised to hear a female voice instead of Ted's. That familiarity and shock from Moira was all it took for Sylvia to put two and two together to figure out what was going on. And unfortunately, she was right. Moira Doolin would be one of Ted Hughes's many affairs. And in that moment, Sylvia became enraged.
Turning to his desk, Sylvia began shredding Ted's manuscripts, tearing them into long strips so as to not truly destroy them, as she later explained, so they could be, quote, taped together. She would also admit to smashing a desk, one that was supposedly a family heirloom and precious to the superstitious Ted. It was in this moment, when Ted found her inconsolable and surrounded by his scattered work, that he lashed out, striking her repeatedly as documented in her letter to Barnhouse. The fight would continue, with Hughes going on to confide to Plath that he never wanted children, a truth he lacked the courage to admit. He confessed that the joy and emotion he had expressed during Sylvia's previous pregnancy was a mere folly, but it's public record that Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes had 2 children. It would be after this that they would give birth to their second child, a son, Nicholas, whose birth story would take on its own significance. In the aftermath of Sylvia's outbursts, Ted, in a moment of distress and rage, did not retreat. Instead, according to story, he began to laugh, telling Sylvia that her passion should be redirected towards her work, something Ted comments on his poem in the Minotaur. And she does so, going on to write The Rabbit Catcher, in one of her most scathing pieces, thalidomide, named after a drug given to pregnant women to help combat depression, one that came with disastrous side effects. causing birth defects and abnormalities, something Sylvia was internally terrified of, having been prescribed said medication during the early point in her pregnancy. Both poems were excluded from the original posthumous publication of Ariel, a decision scholars believe was made to protect Hughes's reputation and shield their children from Sylvia's reality. However, the latter poem's true controversy comes from its metaphorical retelling of the act of lynching, something the racially insensitive Plath had no business touching on, in this author's humble opinion. But back to Hughes. At this point in my research timeline, their relationship is tumultuous, one plagued with abuse, financial distress, but beautiful artistic symmetry. It's only now through the modern lens and the publication of her unabridged journals in 2017 that we see the reality of Plath's maltreatment, with Ted going so far as to admit he felt as if he owed Sylvia another child after everything she had endured at the hands of his apathy, something that the aforementioned poem highlights, with Plath stating that the loss of a child caused Ted barely a morning's anger. And so, on January 16th, 1962, Nicholas Hughes is born, a quasi-joyous moment that Plath documents in her piece Nick and the Candlestick, in which Plath compares her mind and womb to that of an empty ice cave, one barren and devoid of life or warmth, until a mysterious embryo appears to thrive in such conditions. But their new child would not be the miracle cure Sylvia would hope for, as the couple continued to struggle emotionally and financially for the care and comfort of two children. However, November would bring some reprieve when word arrived from the Eugene Saxon Foundation that Sylvia had been awarded a grant for $2,080 for her work on a new novel, The Bell Jar, translating roughly to about 58,000 British pounds by today's standard. Rightfully so, Sylvia is elated, with Plath noting her immediate decision to hire a full-time nanny and housekeeper, help she needs to finish writing what would become her magnum opus. But you see, Sylvia's not exactly being truthful. She's already written The Bell Jar and promised it to a different publisher, but her fear of looming deadlines and the dread of consistency makes her deceitful. So she starts working on her second novel, one that never sees the light of day. And it's here in my research we reach the home stretch of our story. Remember how I said their house was in Devon, out in the beautiful countryside, far removed from what Sylvia would describe as the slums of London? Well, their apartment still exists. It makes no sense to let the apartment sit unoccupied. So, in 1961, the Hughes rent their Chalcott flat to Aja and David Wevel. And the story goes that Ted was immediately smitten with the beautiful Aja, something which Sylvia was privy to from the moment they met. And in the beginning of 1962, shortly after Nicholas is born, the Hughes marriage would take a nosedive.
Mid-June finds Sylvia hot, irrational, and at her wit's end. She's stung by the pain of what she knows is happening between Aja and Ted. Coupling this with the Moira Doolin incident and the postpartum depression from the birth of her second child, Sylvia attempts to take her life once again, this time by staging a car accident, one that she luckily survives and in the moment refuses to admit it was an attempt on her life, although the letters revealed after her death contain admissions of her true intent.
And it's months later that her worst fears are confirmed. Hughes isn't just sleeping with Aja. He loves her, and he's planning on leaving Sylvia for Wevel. And it's complicated. David Wevel wants to be published by Faber and Faber. Sylvia is out of the country, both spouses choosing to ignore the affair that had been going on for some time. According to my research and Heather Clark's biography, it seemed to those around them the idea of the extramarital affair, the poetic beauty that can exist amongst betrayal, was all they needed to spur it on. But in saying that, Sylvia is no fool. She's not new to the burning ire of Hughes's admiration, or how quickly it can go up in smoke. So she bides her time, spending most of the remaining years socializing with Aurelia Plath, who is in England to visit her daughter for what would unknowingly be the last time. In the years following her death, Aurelia would be remiss to find out the complex nature of Sylvia's mental health and marriage, something she would take Ted Hughes and Ruth Barnhouse to task for, blaming them for the dissolution of her daughter and the undermining of their relationship. But Aurelia, like Olive, like Sylvia, is complex, not exempt from the inherited jealousy mothers often feel towards their daughters. To Aurelia, it seems, Sylvia existed as all things at once. A baby with rubber gums bouncing on her lap, a teen girl brave and well-spoken, a blushing bride, a mother, poet, and so on, leading to the 1976 publication of Letters Home, a collection of correspondence between her and Sylvia throughout the latter half of her life. Though it would be critically panned and referred to as a sanitized version of the pietastic Sylvia the world had come to develop in the vignette of her death, it was ultimately Ted Hughes, executor of Sylvia's estate, who had the final say on what would go to print. Something Aurelia would go on to regret until her death by dementia in the 90s.
For me, Letters Home exists as a memory, one uneclipsed by dread or doubt. Aurelia remembers her daughter as she wishes Sylvia could be, something I can hardly fault her for. Because this is the part of Sylvia's story that gets a bit grim, as the periphery of her life starts to come to a pinpoint. And for that, we need dinner, specifically roast beef, mushy peas, and raspberries with cream, the first official meal Sylvia makes in her new gas oven. Hailing from The Joy of Cooking, a compilation of reliable recipes with a casual culinary chat, which that name is such a mouthful. This definitely was a labor-intensive meal, one where the meat was slow roasting forever while you sit and ponder, something I think Sylvia desperately needed as things would have gotten more and more strained from there on.
When Ted and Agia began their affair, Sylvia doesn't retreat into the countryside or fade quietly away. Instead, she fought back in the only way she knew, through her writing. It was during this time that she composed Daddy, her most infamous poem. The poem is narrated by a young Jewish girl whose father is sending her to a concentration camp, an experience Sylvia never lived through nor directly related to. But the poem goes beyond that. It's not just about her German father, Otto, but also a direct strike at Ted. Ted Hughes, despite his acclaim, could allegedly be a bully. As a towering figure, he dominated the literary world at this time, while Sylvia, often sidelined, felt increasingly marginalized. The shame of the affair made her feel isolated from those around her, and she began to see her circle not as her friends, but as Ted's. In response, she used her writing as a craftier form of critique. Daddy was in part a direct reply to Ted's earlier poem I mentioned, Out, laced with sharp and biting anger. The impact of Daddy was immediate. Al Alvarez, a critic for The Observer and a close friend of Ted's, published a glowing review of the poem, which not only praised Sylvia's work, but also embarrassed Ted by elevating her and sidelining him. For Ted, it was a blow to his ego, a reminder that his dominance wasn't unquestioned. All the meanwhile, Alvarez began to shift his attention towards Sylvia, and the two began a brief but intense affair. This relationship reinvigorated Sylvia, giving her both a renewed passion for writing and a sense of purpose she had been lacking. And the name Alvarez came up frequently in my research. In years to come, he would remain influential in maintaining Sylvia Plath's legacy, though he was ultimately unable to commit to her post-breakup from Hughes. At the time, Alvarez laments he was a fragile 30-year-old man, and recently introduced to the love of his life and future wife at a party, deciding then and there to stop any romantic relationships in pursuit of her. He would later go on to regret his behavior, rehashing the events that transpired during what would be their last in-person meeting. According to Al, Plath wanted more than he was willing to give and fled from his house in tears and despair.
However, there are no journals that exist for most of their encounters, as Hughes burned Sylvia's journals from the last 3 years of her life, a decision he excused with a plethora of reasons until his death from cancer in 1998. And truly, it's a shame those journals no longer exist. I think many people theorize about suicide, the end of one's days and what they may look like. I think Sylvia Plath proves they're as normal as any other, that suicide can happen even when you deeply defy it.
No longer able to suffer the separation, Sylvia bravely decides to divorce Ted, and for all witnesses' accounts, she took the news quite well, stating she dyed her hair platinum, adding a fresh crop of bang to her shoulder-length hair, and a few new suits for the future. Here, she decides to move. Scarred by the stain on the Chalcall flat, Sylvia moves into an apartment that once belonged to the famous Thomas Yates. When friends would bring up working it out with Ted, Sylvia would simply shrug them off, insisting she would not be the blind housewife put out to pasture. Sylvia's direct defiance of her own inclination is something I believe adds to her pseudo-sanctum. In the 1982 publication of her first unabridged journals, she chronicles the highs and lows of a light trying to stay lit. In it, she diarized the cruel reality of her marriage failing, at one point discussing the notion that Ted would have known his infidelity would spike suicidal ideations in Sylvia, yet noting that she believed he found the affair worth the risk. This is one of many painful insights that further underscore Sylvia's complex struggle to reconcile her love for Ted with the devastating betrayal she just experienced. And things only get messier in the timeline from then on, especially as it pertains to Plath and Wevel. Her journals document a series of provocative phone calls and biting remarks from Aja, followed by deeply unsettling reflections on Wevel's fertility, which she juxtaposed with the emotional weight of Wevel's previous abortions. In a particularly nasty poem, Plath writes, "You who carry 7 corpses in your bag." Plath would also confess her fear that Wevel harbored a desire to steal her children and her, quote, British life, often invoking Wevel's Jewish heritage in a manner that was both narrow-minded and derogatory. However, in these entries, while Plath's anger is palpable, her rage is not directed at Wevel alone. In truth, her primary target was herself. Despite the venomous mockery and bravado, Plath was consumed by the haunting fear of being abandoned once again by the man she had so completely invested in. It was a fear that stripped away her outward defiance, revealing a woman racked with isolation and insecurity. In her deepest moments of vulnerability, she feared being cast aside or left behind, replaced, ultimately forgotten. The person she feared most in this darkest hour was not Wevel, but in fact herself.
But yet again, Plath finds silver in the storm cloud, writing what would go on to be considered her best piece of poetry, Lady Lazarus, where Sylvia speaks candidly about suicide and the familiarity she shares with the act.
"And I, a smiling woman, I am only 30, and like the cat I have 9 times to die." Hughes eventually left both homes the couple had shared, settling primarily in London. He chose to stay with friends, visiting the children only when it suited him, a fact Plath pointed out, noting how infrequent these visits were. The emotional toll on their daughter Frida was also profound. Sylvia documents her confusion and pain in the wake of Ted's rare visits, echoing her own childhood experiences, particularly the memory of being the 8-year-old girl who cried for the father who would never return. But it's not just that. Plath's sense of abandonment was compounded by her sorrow over Hughes's apparent disinterest in their son, Nicholas. Hughes would later admit this bias in letters and poems, most notably in Full Moon and Little Frida. Couple that with the extremely harsh and bleak London winter that further exacerbated Plath's sense of isolation. The pipes in the Yates house froze and eventually burst. The practical difficulties of daily life, coupled with the emotional strain of motherhood, left her with little time or energy to write. Her journals from this period document a retreat into her own psyche, a struggle to maintain a semblance of stability under the crushing weight of single motherhood. The challenges were not only external, but psychological, as Plath documents feeling suffocated and helpless, caught between the demands of her children and the disintegration of her own sense of self.
Most of my research notes around this time, Plath was struggling not only mentally, but physically as well. Sylvia is a balloon of simmering water, suffering from frequent 104-degree fevers and cases of the flu. At one point, becoming so sick she qualified for government nurses who would come in and take care of her and mind her children.
And unfortunately for Sylvia, that balloon's pop would come in 2 devastating waves. The first was the revelation that Ted had been having an affair with Sarah Elizabeth Rogers, an author whom Sylvia not only admired, but had long aspired to emulate. The betrayal cut even deeper when you take into consideration that Sarah was also a close friend of Plath's brother Warren, and the two had even vacationed together several years earlier. The notion that Ted would replace her with someone who was not only a successful writer, but also so intimately connected to her own family felt like a profound betrayal. Sylvia could not escape the feeling that she was being replaced. And that fear would become cemented into eternity when the BBC debuted Ted Hughes's highly criticized play, The Difficulties of a Bridegroom. The play centers on a man torn between 2 women, one representing lust and the other chastity. During a moment spent with the first woman, he encounters a hare in the road. Goaded by his companion, he deliberately runs over the animal, laughing maniacally at the sudden and senseless death. The couple then retreat to the countryside, where they end up breaking up in a violent argument. As the man leaves, he notices the hare's pelt discarded by the side of the road. In a chilling act of pragmatism, he grabs the bloody pelt, refusing to let the fur go to waste. Upon returning to his hometown, the man sells the pelt and with it buys 3 roses. One he destroys, and the other 2 he gives to his mistress. Sylvia, rightfully so, is livid. By now, their separation is no longer a private affair, but a well-known secret, with friends still imploring Sylvia to give Ted time and reconsider the divorce. The airing of Difficulties of a Bridegroom would silence any remaining hopes for reconciliation. In the play, Ted's statement is simple yet brutal. From the violent death of his first marriage, so too shall grow passion and rebirth. For Sylvia, this felt like their relationship had been nothing more than a prelude to something new and more exciting, leaving her in its destructive wake. The sting of Ted's play is deepened when we consider the earlier poems I mentioned, particularly Rabbit Catcher, the one that chronicles her miscarriage. The parallels are impossible to ignore. Just as Daddy and Lazy Lazarus had been direct responses to her traumatic experiences, Difficulties of a Bridegroom functions as a cold and calculated retort to Rabbit Catcher. Where Sylvia's poem exposes the casual cruelty of Ted's abandonment, his play takes that cruelty and refines it into a theatrical performance. To make matters even worse, Al Alvarez writes a glowing review of the play in The Observer, praising Ted for its, quote, original and imaginative tone. In one swift stroke, both her ex-lover and estranged husband publicly undermined her intimate life, her work, and her suffering, all dismissed in favor of elevating Ted's creation. This public denouncement sends Sylvia into somewhat of an emotional tailspin. She documents at length in her journals the deep shame and the sting of humiliation that followed, a reminder of the vulnerability of being a woman and an artist and a wife in the face of public judgment. But Plath wasn't out for the count yet. In the midst of all this chaos, she would go on to see the English publication of The Bell Jar under the pen name Victoria Lucas on January 14th, 1963. And 10 days later, the reviews would begin to roll in. Critics were pleased, but ultimately unmoved, criticizing Sylvia for the stark contrast between the first and second half of the novel, though it's worth noting Anthony Burgess, author of the iconic Clockwork Orange, praised Sylvia for her depiction of those living within asylums and seeking treatment. Sylvia, however, is worried. The novel was, in many ways, an intimate and raw excavation of her psyche. Yet, despite the vulnerability on display, American publishers weren't biting. In fact, they were asking for more candor, more exposure of her inner life. Sylvia found herself in a confusing, almost paradoxical position. Had she already not exposed her innermost fears, her breakdowns, her battle with mental illness, and the fragility of her relationships? I believe Plath was ultimately gaslit about her own experiences. This rejection from American publishers who demanded more than Sylvia could give drove the final nail into the swollen coffin. Also, as a single mother living in London, Sylvia was banking on the success of The Bell Jar to skyrocket her to financial freedom. She dreamt of using funds to buy houses on Primrose Hill and holidays in Spain. However, in the end, she would touch none of the riches it would come to bring her. Though The Bell Jar found little to no success upon publication, Sylvia's poetry continued to thrive. At the time of her death, Sylvia had 6 poems published posthumously in The New Yorker, with them being interested in another few she had submitted. She saw her works published in The Observer and The Guardian. In fact, in the weeks leading up to her death, Sylvia would see more poems published than she had in months combined. This revelation would come after Sylvia wrote Barnhouse a 6-page letter, the contents of which have never been revealed. Ted and Aja are away in Spain, their holiday so reminiscent of Sylvia's time with Ted that she can hardly stand it. It's then that she writes Edge, what some consider to be a suicide note and not a poem. It opens with the line, "The woman is perfected, her dead," and laments about the relief of finishing suffering, the extinguishing of the mundane. "The moon has nothing to be sad about, staring from her hood of bone," writes Plath. In the weeks following his return to England, she goes on to write Ted a letter as well, noting in it a simple "Goodbye, my love, goodbye," a sentiment that shocks Hughes so much she shows up at her doorstep, terrified and wide-eyed, begging her to stay until the late summer, when the two could, quote, be together once again. You see, contrary to popular knowledge, Hughes did not leave Plath and ride off into the sunset with Weevil and their new child. In fact, by all accounts, Ted was telling Sylvia they were to be together again, albeit sleeping with Aja and other women. You see, at this point in the timeline, Weevil had recently fallen pregnant and decided upon an abortion, a situation which scared Ted to the reality of another life of false domestic bliss, one with a woman who, by his own account, was, quote, "now Sylvia." At the time of her death, Plath was unaware of the pregnancy, although she was aware of Aja's plans to divorce David Wevel and finally give things a go with Hughes. She told Barnhouse at times it felt easier to slip away, to allow Ted to absorb the children and the houses, as she felt the tether securing her to reality loosen further.
And remember the play I mentioned earlier, Difficulties of a Bridegroom? The BBC would air it for a second time on February 9th, just 2 days before Sylvia would take her life. But it's the final safety net that's pushed from underneath her feet that would ultimately be her undoing.
Sylvia's mental state had been in disarray for some time and did not go unnoticed by her mother or the male doctor whom she had been seeing throughout the duration of her stay in England. Remember the $3,000 given to her by Olive Higgins Prouty? The doctor was fond of Sylvia, but he recognized his limitations would prevent her from receiving adequate psychiatric help. So, at the request of Plath, he wrote a letter to a female psychiatrist asking personally if she would take on Plath as a patient. But a reply never comes, because the letter, lost in transit, never makes it. And in the absence of treatment stands before Plath the one thing she swore she would never do again. Another stay in an asylum. This one in the brute, stoic English sanatoriums that haunt the newspaper and Bronte narratives. Needless to say, Sylvia was petrified. She was 30, had made it out of Boston, moved to England, and married the most successful poet of their generation. She had 2 children and a house in the country, and in her head she had lost it all. Now all that lay before her seemed too daunting and reminiscent to her time at McLean. On Friday, February 11th, 1963, Sylvia Plath would take her own life. She was set to be institutionalized that very day. She made Nicholas and Frida sandwiches with jam and butter, placed a bottle in each crib, and tucked in her sleeping babies for what would be the last time. She then used thick, sticky tape with wool sweaters and rags to methodically seal off the doors and windows of her children's room. Plath, then turning to the stove she once adored, splurged and worried about, where she baked pies and fried fish, laid her head down on its door, and succumbed to carbon monoxide poisoning. On the baby stroller in the shared front hallway, she left a simple note. Call the doctor. Her body would be discovered some hours later by the German au pair who was sent to mind the children while she was away. Both babies were wailing and breathless, but alive. Sylvia was pronounced dead upon arrival at the hospital, and Ted Hughes would receive a phone call, "Your wife is dead." The night prior, he had spent with his mistress at a getaway, the same place he spent with Sylvia the night of their wedding. He had decided upon it as to avoid Sylvia's multiple calls and, quote, tantrums in the middle of a night. A decision he stated he would regret for the rest of his life. Which is interesting, considering my research shows that Hughes' actions post-Plath death have been condemned by an array of scholars. But Heather Clark's biography sheds light on the true reality of Hughes' living and mental state in a post-Sylvia world.
Frequently on record flipping through emotions, Ted Hughes ultimately speaks about Plath as if it was either a her or him scenario, stating on record that neither could exist in a world with each other, but most definitely not without each other either. He goes on to acknowledge his hand in the state of Sylvia's mental decline, even openly taking the blame for her death, at one point saying, "It does not fall to many men to murder a genius." Ooh, Ted Hughes is so lucky necromancy ain't a thing, cause anyways.
Sylvia is buried in a quiet cemetery on the moors, something Plath admirers have found much disdain with, that and the inclusion of the last name Hughes on her headstone, something that is now gouged out and scratched over frequently by visitors leaving pens or bits of paper in memoriam. However, in 1960s England, the two were very much still considered married, and research would show the graveyard at their Devon home, in which Sylvia wished to be buried, was reserved for friars, members of the religious convent in town. None of Sylvia's friends were in attendance, not even Al Alvarez. Notably absent also is Ted's sister Olwen, who had been estranged from Sylvia for some time after screaming matches Christmases before. It's said the female Hughes accused Sylvia of conspiring to erase her from Ted's life, something Ted's letters admit to being a frequent occurrence between his sister and past lovers. I'm not going to dive into Olwen Hughes in this video as it doesn't seem pertinent, but she hasn't been shy about her dislike for Sylvia. As co-executor of her estate, she's been interviewed time and time again, often on record speaking candidly about her distaste for Plath and her American ways.
At the actual wake following her funeral, it's documented that Ted was inconsolable, almost manic. In one breath announcing that everybody hated Sylvia, and then the next sobbing that if there was to be an Eden in the afterlife, he was damned from it, and that life on earth with Plath was the closest that he had ever come. But all of that being said, at the moment it's being said, makes me want to take a moment to talk about something. I wanted to focus on Ted Hughes in light of Sylvia's death and close out her memory there. But if you are familiar with her story, then you'll know I need to talk about the elephant in the room, specifically the other woman.
Aja Wevel is a deeply complicated woman who, by all accounts, was not kind or considerate towards Sylvia. However, for the sake of brevity and reality, I'll try to stick to what we know as fact. Now pregnant for the second time and deciding on keeping it, Aja is bogged down by the reality of her situation. She slips into an almost eerily similar depression to Plath. Her journals at this time and recollections from friends all amount to a deeply troubled and scared Jewish woman in a post-World War trying to find her way through. She had bet on Hughes's horse and lost. Aja felt herself swiftly inheriting Sylvia's seat at the window, watching and waiting for when reprieve from domesticity would arrive. Her journals state that she did not want to be the wife in the North. It had been 4 years since Plath had passed, and Wevel had given birth to a baby girl, Shura. She documents her time reading Plath's journals, her poems, raising her children, and living in her houses. At one point admitting she felt Sylvia's ghost siren singing to her, beckoning that she come join her in whatever lay beyond. The same fears once expressed by Plath manifest in Aja. She is convinced that Ted doesn't love Shura as much as Frida and Nicholas, fearful of the life her daughter would have to live should she fall to the same fate Plath had. And it doesn't help that upon meeting Hughes's family for the first time, they are less than kind. To add insult to injury, her divorce with David is now final, and Ted is refusing to marry her. His reason being he, quote, can't bear the shame and, quote, won't insult his mother by legitimizing his transgressions, with Edith Hughes openly stating the marriage would be a shame on their family name. Couple this with the fact that Ted once again has grown bored of domestic life with Aja and is now seeing 2 new women at the country home in Devon, and again you have a pressure cooker. By all journalistic accounts, Wevel is tired of playing second fiddle to a ghost, something she admits to Ted on a panicked phone call while he is away for work in Manchester. That night she would go on to define the relationship as a bad habit, something she could only see one way out of. Aja Wevel would dose herself and her 4-year-old daughter Shura with sleeping medication after turning on the gas stove in the couple's home, leading both of them to succumb to carbon monoxide poisoning.
The death of Aja, in the same manner that Sylvia had gone, left an imperishable stain on Ted's reputation, one that would only grow muddier as posthumous publications began to roll out. Her aerial anthology is published with 7 pieces of its original source material excluded in the final draft, although Hughes openly admits to having these pieces taken out, stating that the decision was done at the behest of Aja Wevel before her death and to protect his remaining children the best that he could, which most scholars agree makes sense. However, they chastise him for the additional 14 pieces that are included in the English publication of Ariel. And all of this questioning leads the American publication to scrap the additional 14 and include the original 7 as Sylvia had always intended.
However, it's not until Al Alvarez publishes a deeply personal and moving article in The Observer, accompanied by a program on the BBC, that we see Ariel's star start to rise, highlighting her dedication to reality and the despair of it in spite of joy. He highlights her prose and use of Greek metaphors, and with it he includes some simple photographs of a smiling Plath and her baby children. The country is enamored. Suicide was and still is a deeply taboo and personal subject that many wish to shy away from. Plath's life and poetry peeled back the eyelids of a nation and held them in place as they digested her words. Readers were astonished that someone like them, a bright, beautiful 30-year-old woman, could do such a violent thing. They don't understand her. And so, in an attempt to, the bell jar flourishes. Heinemann orders another round of copies to be sent to print, and in the 1970s, the bell jar is published in America, no longer under the pseudonym, something Olwen Hughes and several other Plath associates state would have dismayed her, as Sylvia was against so publicly tying Olive and Aurelia to their fictional personas. It's a decision that severs what's left of the fragile relationship between the remaining Plath family members and Ted Hughes. To top it all off, Faber and Faber will now be publishing her work. The powerhouse she was so scared to belong to now sees 4 million plus copies of the bell jar sold nationwide.
Ted Hughes would go on to be one of the most celebrated poets of our time. He was actually the poet laureate for the United Kingdom until his death. And remember those journals I mentioned, the one he publishes in 1982? Well, alongside those, he shares collected poems, which is a culmination of every piece of unpublished poetry Plath wrote from 1956 onward, offering a small insight into those missing years of her journal. And he made the right decision, as collected poems would go on to win a Pulitzer Prize, cementing Sylvia in American literary history and acknowledging her labor as a pioneer of confessional poetry. However, what would happen to Plath's legacy in the aftermath of her death could have never been foreseen or controlled. No one decides if they get to become a pop culture icon.
Feminist and lit cliques flock to her stories en masse, some relating, some fascinated, some enraged by Ted Hughes. The complicated legacy of a woman reduced to whatever version of her work her cheating, allegedly abusive husband found fit. But what persists beyond her romantic relationships is a snapshot of existence. Sylvia's words remain a burning funeral pyre all women must meet with familiarity. For many, Plath captures the unfortunate, surrounds it with reality, and shakes it vicious like a globe, allowing her words to settle around readers like indefinite facts. She's a complicated woman who was undoubtedly a product of her environment. She could be male-centered, bigoted, jealous, bitter, all things that make women seem mad. Yet, she existed in the minds of many. To Frida, Plath is a loving mother, struggling under the weight of words yet not diagnosed or defined. For Hughes, she is a love gone awry. Aurelia, the prodigal daughter who never returned home. I suppose for the rest of us, she exists somewhere between a cautionary tale and idolization. For all her many flaws and missteps, Plath breathed life into topics women typically reserved for whispers and cocktail hours. And though in recent years her legacy has come into contest, her praise being something akin to cult worship, I'm not here to establish a public ethos, to say if it's right or wrong to enjoy Sylvia Plath and her writing. But I'm simply saying a third thing, basking in all that comes with her remembrance, knowing that in life, the buried girl has finally had her say. Bye, guys.